Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. I came in on the tail end of your discussion. I'm sure I missed it. I need to go back and review it if I could. Sounded very exciting and very interesting. So my name is Phyllis Richards. I'm here with my colleague, Jerica Broeckling, and we're here to talk to you about unraveling culture, identifying and understanding organizational culture and the factors that impact it. So we're so happy to be with you here today. We are both from Social Current, and we have done work with the ICA group, and so thankful that they invited us to join this conference today. Our agenda today, we'll have a welcome and ground rules and a check-in time. We'll talk about what is culture, how culture is manifested in the workplace, strategies for building an inclusive culture, and we'll have times for question and answers. So let's get to it. So we try to make sure that every time we have a workshop or some engagement that we set ground rules. These ground rules are important for everyone to feel like this is a brave and safe space to have a conversation. And so we ask that you adhere to these ground rules. Use your active listening skills, listen to learn and understand, not just to respond. Use I statements, speak for yourself and not for others. Be honest in your personal reflection, share as much as you feel comfortable with. Be respectful. Each person has a unique experience. Be open-minded, suspend judgment of others. Ask questions, and always feelings are allowed. Our check-in question today, we're going to use a tool called Slido to get your responses. We want you, the check-in question is, what do you hope to learn in today's session? And if you can just go to slido.com and enter the code at 928864, 928864, or you can try to use this QR code. My colleague, Jerica Broeckling, is going to bring up her screen as the responses come in, and we'll be able to share what those responses are. Again, what do you hope to learn in today's session?
Hi, and I'm Jerica Broeckling. Ooh, it's good to be with you. I've been talking all day, so I promise I will slow down, and I look forward to this conversation that we have today. So while you guys are adding your answers, what do you hope to learn in today's session? I'm going to share the screen so we have the opportunity to be able to see what everyone is responding. Just do a quick check of the chat. Okay, yes. So the code you should be able to see on the left-hand side of your screen now. Slido.com, and then it's the 6 digits should get you into this question. All right, so we should see responses starting to come in. How to maintain democracy in a business structure. How do you balance creating culture while also letting go of control? Absolutely. Practical tools for inclusive, non-judgmental conversations. Fantastic. How do you recognize unspoken culture? And when do you see something you don't like? What can you do? Hope to learn how to navigate the culture of a home care worker co-op. Awesome. So we will be able to address some of those things today. We want to speak to you, sort of give you some of these general tools around how do we start to recognize where culture is part of our organization and in how we engage with each other as individuals. We're going to have some space for folks to think about how this applies in the home care worker co-op setting, and also think about strategies for really reinforcing and building that inclusive culture, those democratic practices in this business structure. One last comment, how to promote engagement and a welcoming environment for diverse opinions and conflict. Awesome. Really appreciate that. So I think this is going to be a really good session. we do not have a ton of time to be able to share a lot of back and forth, but we at least want to be able to hear from you at the beginning to touch base on how this is going to go. And we will definitely have time at the end for questions. So Phyllis, I'll turn it back to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you very much, Jerica. All right. So what is culture? So we're talking about unraveling culture, but let's define what culture is. Let's talk about what do we mean by culture. So according to David Livermore of the Cultural Intelligence Center, culture is deeply rooted patterns of values, customs, attitudes, beliefs that distinguish one group from another. And it subconsciously guides our behavior and thoughts and thus influences everything. Sometimes we think of culture and we just think of our cultural. We think of other cultures like other countries or ethnic cultures, but it's more than that. It's broader than that, and it's deeper than that. So let's look at another definition. This is from Broeckling, and she says, culture is the shared patterns that help us make a meaning of our environment and determine appropriate behavior. The way we see the world and numerous aspects of the world. So again, that's broader, deeper. It's not just one from one country to another, one ethnicity to another, one race to another, but it's actually the things that we do that are cultural. When we look at culture, we can look at it in two different ways. We can look at culture in an objective way or a subjective way. So the objective way we can look at culture, we're going to use this analogy of this iceberg to do so. The objective way is something that's very observable, not very nuanced, not very complex, things that you easily notice. So when we think about culture in that way, we can think about someone's language may be different, or maybe someone's music, or someone's foods or games. And so when we think about culture in a subjective way, underneath the word line, beneath the surface, we think about it in a way that's very subjective and very nuanced, very complex. The iceberg tends to be bigger underneath the water than it is above the water. When we think about culture in a subjective way, we're talking about people's beliefs, their social expectations, their behaviors and values and roles, those perceptions that they have of the world. That's more nuanced. It's more complex. You really have to get to know somebody to start understanding what those behaviors and values are. They're not as obvious as just looking or listening or watching. They're not as observable. To get more specific, let's look at some areas of culture that's subjective. Let's think about people's way and culture in a more broader sense, like people's attitudes or notions about beauty, people's understanding of what friendship means, or approaches to conflict, or views on parenting, or viewpoints on work, concepts of fairness, notions of self, leadership styles, maybe just etiquette, or attitudes towards social status. Those are cultural views. Those are ways that we were developed. We can see this. We can see culture in between regions, between states, that there's different cultural things and norms that we have, depending on where we live or where we grew up. I've known people who have lived in the South part of the United States and moved to the Midwest, and they say, oh, that culture is different, that people think of things different in a different way. So culture has a lot of dimensions to it and can be very deep and not as observable as just someone's language or maybe their physical attributes. So when we think of cultural biases, that's the tendency to interpret things in terms of how things are related to your values, from your community, from your upbringing, from your culture, to interpret or to judge phenomena or things from that vantage point. Interpreting actions or values or social norms based on your own standards from your own culture. That's where cultural bias comes in. It's not that acknowledging that there's difference, but acknowledging, but then making the next step of interpreting and judging whether one based on your own norms, something is wrong or right, or viewed different or weird, or whatever the word you want to use. So let's talk about that cultural bias. Can you describe some of your own cultural values? Here's some examples. What does it mean to be on time? So I grew up in a large urban area and my parents did not have a car. And so we used public transportation. The other thing is that my parents believed that being on time was 10 minutes early. That was problematic for me in general. But we also, because we had to use public transportation, we were there maybe a half hour early because you can never tell exactly with public transportation are you going to be on time. So we had to be early for the train or the bus, and then be early because being on time meant 10 minutes early. This became really problematic for me when I was a teenager and I had a curfew. Because for me, being on time for curfew could have meant being 10 minutes later than what they thought. I was close to being on time. But what does on time mean to you? And how does that happen if you're in a meeting and you perceive on time as 10 minutes early, or you perceive on time as being 5 minutes after the time that it starts? Do you have a bias towards that person? Do you have some ideas about them? What are the qualities of behaviors that are important to be considered a good team member? So growing up, I was, as an African-American woman, I was always told that I had to be doubly good to be equal. So my work ethic tends to be kind of skewed a little bit. So I had to, as a manager, think about, when somebody works 40 hours and we pay them for 40 hours, that's good. They don't have to work 80 hours. They don't have to work 60 hours. But in my head, how I grew up and in my culture, and however I responded to what was told to me and the system that I lived in, being doubly good meant that I had to do more work or do more than other people. But then did I carry that bias into when I think of my colleagues? I had to really step back and look at my own viewpoint and how I grew up in my culture and what that meant. Or what does it mean to be a good friend? In some situations, my family set the standard that good friends mean that you're really involved and you talk to people when they're having a problem, you're there for them, no matter what. But for some people, that doesn't mean the same thing. And then if we talk about our own cultural values, how did you learn about these values? How important are they? Bias comes in because of how we decide to interpret actions and values and social norms based on the standards of our own culture. So with that, we want to talk about how culture manifests itself in the workplace. And what does that mean? Let's take a step back and find out what's some of the key definitions about things that we want in our culture. So lately, as of late, and all the time, we're talking about diversity, right? I'm talking about the need to have representation at the table. We're talking about wanting the people at the table. We're talking about acknowledging that there's differences and we need people from various races and age and gender and sexual orientation, physical ability, learning styles. We want those people at the table. So diversity is kind of counting the people, like we want the people at the table. Inclusion is that we have the people and the people count, like they matter. An inclusive workplace is one that removes the barriers to full participation. They use this principle of engaging all voices, encouraging diverse thinking at all levels of the organization. Like we really want to hear their voices. Their voices matter. They are, we want to hear from their different lens and point of view. We appreciate and respect what they're doing, their viewpoint. We not only welcome it, but we really want it to be part of our normal processes. Inclusive environments create space for people to represent themselves in authentic ways. So with those things in mind, let's think about organizational culture. So often we think of organizational culture as this kind of nebulous thing that doesn't really Like, I don't know how it comes. It's just, we just have this culture. It's just what we do. But organizational culture really isn't a nebulous thing. It really is what we have here from achievers.com. It's the collection of values and expectations and practices that guide and inform the actions of the team members. It's the way to behave and how things get done. So there are some explicit or implicit rules of our culture, and people are putting those together. I know I've been in a situation, I'm sure you have, that you've been to a new group or been to a new organization, and you just want to know, how do I get this thing approved? And you look in the handbook and it says, here's these different steps. But that doesn't seem to be working. So you ask your coworker, Martha, and she says, you know what? We don't do that. That's what's in the handbook. But here's what we really do, because this is how it gets done. Because otherwise that just takes too long and we really have to get going. And so here's the steps to do that. That's the culture. That's part of the culture. It's how we get things done. It's how we behave to get things done. With that in mind, that means our team members are putting those things together. That means that we can change our culture. We can make our culture to be the way that's more inclusive, that's more equitable, because we are the people that's actually creating the culture. We're making it. So what are those things that we want to have in our culture that is more inclusive, that shows that allows for different things, for us to have an inclusive organization and an inclusive culture? Well, here's several of them. There is not an exhaustive list. But first of all, having diversity of thought, being encouraged and respected. It's one thing to have people at the table, but when they bring up new things, what do we think about that? Team members feeling safe to bring their authentic self to work and not pressure to assimilate. Bringing your authentic self to work is one of the hallmarks of being inclusive. And what does that really mean for them? To take the mask off is what our colleagues was just talking about. Is to really be yourself and be able to share your lived experiences, and that's valued and appreciated. When you're looking at your current policies and practices, how do you develop them? Do you review them often? Do you use an inclusive lens and engage in all voices? All the people that these policies are going to affect, do you include their voices in the process? So when we talk about inclusive culture, we're consistently reviewing and looking at our policies and procedures, so to see who is this policy procedure affecting, who is it meant for, who derived it, who gets the benefit from it. Is it really meeting the objective that we're trying to meet, or is it not? When we look at team members, are we open to new ways of thinking, problem solving, and strategies for decision making? That can be really big, because sometimes as we make decisions or we're in leadership positions or however the team is set up, we may be used to making those decisions on our own, or a handful of people making those decisions. When we're asked or kind of pushed to open that up to others, it may be a little bit hard for us to do. We have to really work through our own biases and feelings of self-worth and leadership. Psychological safety. Amy Edmondson talks a lot about this, and it's really about being able to be honest and give candor within the team, to be honest about different issues without fear of retribution. So we can talk about different things that are happening to make things better. How can we improve the team with honesty and candor? And then a sense of belonging. How important that is to feel that you belong to an organization, that your viewpoint, your expertise, who you are is valued, respected, and welcomed. That you are allowed to take off your mask, that you feel like people are looking for your input and looking for your viewpoint to the situation. Those are just some things that help to have an inclusive culture. And I'm going to ask you a reflection question at this point. Do you feel challenged when new team members suggest new ways of thinking or responding to a situation at work? Can you think of an example? Do you feel challenged when new team members suggest a new ways of thinking or responding to a situation at work? You just think about those things as we're going to switch over to Jerica, who's going to talk to you about, well, what does that mean? If that's what we're talking about, having an inclusive organizational culture, what are the things that get in our way of doing that? What are the biases and different things that get in our way to do that? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. You guys reflect on that as we change over.
Yeah, I certainly can name a couple of examples in which I got really challenged from somebody bringing up a new perspective on the way things should go, often built on the foundations of something that I spent a lot of time on. And I feel like I have the knowledge and skills. So it can be really challenging. None of these questions that we ask are sort of gimme questions. They really are, these are things that we all face in our daily work environment. We want to think about another facet of what gets in the way. Phyllis started out this conversation thinking about the cultural foundations that we come from. And as we get into a space, especially as we get into a very intentional kind of organization like a co-op, where we have democratic practices, we have very explicit policies often that help set those standards for bringing all voices in and making sure that we all have the ability to contribute. Those are very intentional processes, but we still have things that get in our way. So culture is one of those things. The way we've always done things, that's an important thing to think about. Another thing to keep in mind is that our own nature as humans also gets in our way. Despite our best intentions, despite our growth and maturity into adulthood, we still have in our deepest brains processes that are creating stereotypes, that are creating in groups and out groups, that are saying yes to this person, no to that person before they even open their mouths to share. I just want to briefly remind us, for folks who already know this, and for folks who may not be familiar with this, give you a little neurological foundation for some of this, because we're really talking about working with intentionality against multiple fronts. So our brain creates groups. An in-group is someone that we are very familiar with, whether that is because we've worked together a really long time, like myself and Phyllis, she's a close colleague, whether it is somebody who shares a cultural background with me, someone who shares a physical resemblance to me, lots of things that our brain has decided, yes, this person is safe. There are actually brain chemicals that get activated, different parts of the brain, your prefrontal cortex gets activated, your empathy systems get activated. And before that person can even share with you, you have already said, this person is low risk. You should be interested and set up to really listen and care about what this person says. That's wonderful. We have groups of people that we care about, that we are part of our group. We don't have to fight hard to listen and react to those folks with empathy. The challenge is that while the brain creates in groups, it also creates out groups. And the out groups are often created from implicit bias, from those stereotypes that are sort of reinforced throughout society from the time that we're born, whether we have engagement with stereotypes as children or whether we're only absorbing them through the outside environment and the media and education, all of those spaces in which we learn this group is this way, this group is that way. Our brain responds and creates stereotypes. And the challenge of that is that this brain is faster than our brain that creates empathy and engagement. So we're talking about a different part of our brain that is in control, our amygdala gets activated. So we are getting actually flooded with chemicals that spark that fight or flight mechanism. And we may react with an emotional response rather than actually being able to slow down and listen to someone. So we have multiple kinds of groups that our brain has decided this is what these groups are, that is impacting the way that we engage with folks. The good news is that once we know that this is happening, we have the ability to increase our awareness, to gain new knowledge and grow into our ability to sort of reduce the impact of those outgroups. You can change someone, an outgroup to an in-group with time and with intentionality through your thinking processes. One other thing that gets in our way that I want us to be aware of is that there's two scales of bias. So researchers look into what they call the warmth scale and the competence scale. So there are groups of people that we may be asked about these folks, we may determine that they are likable, they are trustworthy, they're good natured, someone that you would want to be friends with or that you feel friendly to. There's a totally different scale around competence. Do we consider someone to be capable, skillful, intelligent? Do we want them leading things? We can feel really warm and friendly towards someone and really low towards them in terms of competence. So we have to be aware that even though we feel like this person we have a good connection, we're friendly to this person, we may still hold an implicit bias about them because of, again, these stereotypes that are built into us from early childhood all throughout our lives that says something about their competence. A really common example of this is the elderly. We may feel very warm and friendly and sincere towards people who identify as elderly, but we may feel like they are less competent. That is one of the stereotypes that is really highlighted in society for us. So being able to think about when I engage with another person, if I like them, that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't have a bias. And so it's really imperative to go back to what Phyllis was talking about at the very beginning. Do we know our own culture? Do we understand how we feel about our different values? Do we know where those things come from? That first step of awareness can help us to then unpack and think about how we're thinking and feeling about other groups. So how does all of this come together in terms of creating an inclusive workplace culture? What we want to leave you with is a couple of things. First is, again, there's lots of factors that go into this challenge. There are lots of reasons that people feel safe or a sense of belonging in a workplace. There's lots of intentionality and growth that is required to build the kind of inclusive workplace culture that we want to have. But there are lots of things that we can do that can help us along the way while we are starting to grow. So it's very important to pay attention to self and to start to learn and engage and expand our worldview. It's also really important to take a look at what does our workplace look like? Where are we reinforcing the things that we don't want to actually have happen in our workplace? And how do we change that? So we love bias interrupters. This is a model that you can go and find on the internet. You just type in bias interrupters. I believe it's biasinterrupters.org. There are a lot of really practical tips that are out there on how you can start to make changes to your processes that will help you to reinforce what you're doing in your own learning and growth, to help you to reinforce reducing bias. So there are recommendations out there in hiring, in how we assign our daily work, in how we go about engaging in our meetings, and even in how we go about our performance reviews. So really common areas. I do want to focus on just a couple of these because I think they are so critical to just how we exist and show up in the workplace every day. And we may not always think about where bias is embedded in these spaces. When you think about what folks do on a daily basis and what is your daily task and who assigns those daily tasks, this is a space where we find that bias is really commonly creeping in. One instance is that women report doing about 20% more of what we call office housework than their male counterparts. So who's creating the agenda, who's filing the report, who's creating the meeting calendar, who's buying lunch, who's doing the actual housework of the office. All of those things that we might lump into the dull but necessary tasks that have to happen. There's so many reasons that that happens. One, because women are very socialized to be helpers. And there's also really concrete ways that we can begin to disrupt that practice. So some things that you can think about: rotate those office housework duties. So every week it's a new person, and do not allow volunteers. Because when you allow volunteers, you open the door for people to allow bias back in. You can also do some tracking. Who gets which assignments? Who is able to move ahead based on really excellent work within a project? Are we seeing power dynamics and who tends to get those projects that put them in front of people for a promotion opportunity? How do we rebalance them? So some common ways, some easy ways that a lot of times come down to transparency and structure. Another thing to think about is meeting culture. This is a really, again, common thing that we can think about. Many of us spend a lot of time in meetings. So how we agree to engage with each other in these conversations is really important. Phyllis shared with you at the very beginning some guide rules. We use these all the time when we work with clients. They're also something that you can create and adopt and agree to when you are in a regular working relationship with your colleagues. Thinking about how do we look for some of these biases that happen that are just very commonplace in a meeting culture, and how do we agree that we're going to address them? When we see stereotyping happen, are we going to respond? When we see double standards, whether it's a gender-based standard or racial standard, any other kind of marginalization that creates multiple standards, how are we going to notice it and address it when it happens? Who gets interrupted? Who takes credit for the idea? Those are things that we can include in that. We can also be very intentional about asking people to weigh in. So this is also a really important thing that is related to culture, understanding who is able to speak up in a meeting and who sits back and listens. Some of that is cultural. So create multiple ways in which people can weigh in based on their comfort. Sometimes that is asking for an open conversation at the end of the meeting. Sometimes that's creating space for anonymous feedback later on. Sometimes that is a quiet one-on-one with folks. Being sensitive to what that looks like and creating space for it to happen, and acknowledging that that is the way that we create inclusive behavior, not that we all get comfortable with the mad brainstorm where everybody is sort of throwing in. We don't have to build towards that standard. We can also think about how we schedule meetings, making sure that they are intentionally inclusive so that everyone has equal opportunity to participate. If you have a managerial sort of relationship with folks who report to you, how do you create access to yourself as the supervisor? Are there some folks who happen to step up and knock on your door significantly more than others? What does that look like? How does that create an impact on your daily engagement with the various folks who report to you? And then back to what Phyllis was talking about earlier, our individual and group interactions that contribute to and reinforce that workplace culture. So again, pause and think about your daily interactions with your colleagues and your program participants. Are there opportunities to hear perspectives that are different from your own? Do they get built into your daily work environment? Is there a way that we can be intentional in approaching those conversations with curiosity and with openness? And what would our meetings look like if we did that? Is there a way that we can formalize that in our agenda or in the agreements that we make at the beginning of each meeting? Are there opportunities for folks to interact who have different perspectives, different daily work environments? Or are we really still in our silos, focused on the work that we have to get done? Can we create opportunities to share with each other what those perspectives look like? So we don't have a ton of like A, B, C, D, these are the things you do, and then your culture will be inclusive. Instead, as you can see, Phyllis and I are asking a lot of questions. We want to leave you with some questions to think about that you can take back into your organization to start some conversations about inclusive culture and where you might have the opportunity to continue strengthening your practice of inclusivity. So in the space of leadership and power, as we practice leadership in this co-op structure, where is that working well? And where is it stagnant? What do we need to review and make adjustments to so that we really are able to use these democratic practices? Where do we see power and influence playing an outsized role in our decision-making? Often that's informally because our formal practices have created that very egalitarian structure. So what is happening in that informal space? And then again, where do we see that direct conflict? Are they in contradiction with each other? If they are, what needs to be adjusted? Do we need to go back and look at those formal practices, or do we really need to come back and do some training, some reflection, and some intentional team building so that our informal practices can better reflect our formal ones? This starting question, Phyllis and I like to ask a lot: who gets to speak in meetings? Who doesn't? Whose voice is heard? Sometimes this is a really good starting point that can take you down a really interesting path. As you think about the people who make up the organization, thinking about what does it look like to create intentional inclusivity in the way that we develop our people? Does everyone have a structured opportunity for professional development? That means not on top of your regular workload, here's some documents to read. Is it built into your work schedule or into your yearly schedule so that you have the opportunity to do it without taking on the additional burden? Do all employees have the opportunity to practice leadership? And what does that look like? Can we do this in both formal ways and informal ways? And how do we both note it and make bring it into the annual performance review of the various processes that affect a person's career path and pay? And then finally, how might we hold those meetings differently if we are truly encouraging new ideas and perspectives? So, Phyllis, before we get to question and answers, do you have anything to add to what I just shared?
Well, I think you covered a lot there. There's a lot of questions that we need to really examine as we're talking about an inclusive culture. And I think, it also boils down to the team members making a decision that we want to delve into this and make this an inclusive culture on a consistent basis. We can sit down, in the beginning and think of all these things, like you said, and then have all these practices, but are we really willing to review them? Are we willing that when we have a new person come in, they bring up an issue, are we willing to go back and honestly look at how we set things up and what really happens? So I think it's challenging to do. It's also very a journey that people have to take. We talk about from our consulting business, how we talk about the person org system and how important it is for you having your personal journey to understand where your biases are and have an organization understanding where they are going and what the team is doing. So both of those things need to happen at the same time, and being aware of when things arise, when you feel some kind of way in a meeting, to take a step back, to listen to your slow brain, to think about why are these biases, what's happening, why am I responding? Is this the best way to respond? Is this what I want? Is this how I want to show up? And is this how I want our group to show up? So.
Thank you. Okay, so that is the end of our presentation. We would love to have a conversation with you all, how this is hitting you, whether you have any questions or reflections on what we've shared.
I can get us started. I am curious to know if you have any tips on unconscious bias, because that's certainly a factor that affects organizational culture. And is there any type of advice or tips and tricks that we could talk about and maybe apply in helping us to curb that unconscious bias?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that the some of these structures that we have recommended in terms of meetings are things that we can use that will help address unconscious bias. But the really important thing is that we cannot reduce unconscious bias through our policies and practices alone. It has to start with our own understanding, our awareness, and our intentionality to reduce bias within ourselves and within the organization. Otherwise, it's just a new set of rules and regulations that we are going to find a way around because we don't have the awareness of how we are behaving. So it starts with that raising of awareness. And Phyllis always talks about starting with self-reflection to get into that awareness raising.
And also I want to add to that, we talk about being aware of new perspectives and new worldviews. As you would intentionally put yourself in spaces where there's diversity, where there's and willing to be open and to listen to others and see their points of view, that you begin to see your own bias. You begin to see the things that you have, that you've done for years growing up maybe, or even in something that you recently learned, that you really, oh, well, maybe someone sees it in a different way, and it kind of challenges you, gives you that little bit of pause or distance as you're talking to someone who has a different worldview, a different way of seeing things. That's something that needs to be intentional in your personal journey as you addressing your EDI journey, what we call your equity, diversity, inclusion journey. It's having those intentional moments that I'm putting myself in a place that I'm not familiar with, to learn, to grow, to interact with people. And then those things will begin to show up. Oh, that's how I used to do that. This is how I see this. It could just be as simple as in the place that we live in Wisconsin, Halloween is celebrated on the Sunday afternoon at 2:00 in the afternoon. That's when people go out to do trick-or-treating. I didn't grow up that way. I grew up that we went trick-or-treating on the actual Halloween. My kids grew up in Wisconsin. They went and left and went to college, and they came back and said, "Mom, do you know that people don't celebrate Halloween like we do?" It's just that simple. This is what they're used to, but they were able to go somewhere differently and talk to people and see something different, which helped them to realize this is a rule, a way of thinking that was totally different than what they were used to. And that begins to challenge your thinking. Hope that helps.
That's great. Thank you.
Hello, I had a question. This is John Holtzclaw. Hope you all are doing well. How much do you hear people talk about employee resource groups or affinity groups? How much do affinity groups play in the overall culture of an organization? I mean, yeah, I've kind of heard mixed bag of folks who say, why separate people? Why not just have everybody in one? Just want to get your take on that. Thank you.
We love affinity groups.
Yes.
We recommend them a lot. Yeah, definitely, we've heard the same thing you've heard, John, that there are folks who feel like, oh, I'm being excluded because I don't get to listen in, or that makes me fearful. They may not use those words, but that's sort of what's underlying that sometimes. But I think Phyllis was talking about that psychological safety. We have to start where we are. If we are not in a space where people who have a shared identity are safe enough to express themselves or to bring their viewpoints forward, whatever it may be within the organization, an affinity group is a really important means to give people the opportunity to begin sharing and connecting with each other. If there is a lot of fear around it, there's always an opportunity to have one big open door group as well. And to sort of create that balance to say, this is why this is important. And then we also have this bigger space for folks to be able to share out to increase that transparency, because anything we can do to reduce the fear is helpful in terms of building that psychological safety.
Awesome. Thank you.
It also is important, John, that even within the affinity groups, that there's some structure, that they have some ideas of what they're going to be doing. That is not just we're getting together. It is about, what things are we going to address? How are we going to be within the structure of the team or a co-op? How is this going to be helpful to the larger team? And how can we be? So it may be that sometimes during that there's affinity groups together, but once maybe all the groups together at one time to do something together, that we have to come, that we have something, but it does allow for people to be able to, I think on the point of sometimes when we're in groups that all of us, there is a tendency for people of color to feel like they have to represent everybody, or they are looked upon to answer all the questions about people who are marginalized. And so that gives them that, it ends the fatigue a little bit. It helps them process so that they can be able to share, but also it also lets those groups, we have affinity groups that are ally groups, and they're learning without that pressure of the person who's in the minority or the marginalized group having to answer all the questions. They're learning together. They're actually asking questions that they can stumble along and learn from someone else who's further along in their ally group that can help them. That's not always putting that pressure on the person up from their marginalized group. So there's a lot of benefits to it. It may seem like, and I know that years past, we're like, oh no, we're all going to be the same, all colorblind, we're all together. It's really beneficial to everybody, only people.
Yeah, we have to move beyond that.
Thank you.
There are some questions. Thank you for the question, John.
A couple of great questions in the chat. Yeah. So McGriffin asks about how do we get this started when leadership doesn't understand? I really appreciate that question. I apologize. I don't see if we should just call you McGriffin. But this is something that we started talking about many years ago. How do we really kickstart this journey? There's a few things I'll throw out, and then Phyllis, if you wouldn't mind adding to it. So one of the things that we talk about is really what can you do from the grassroots? What's available to you? Can you ask for some time and space at lunch to start some brown bag lunch conversations with folks? Anything to start to build a set of allies within the organization. What you are ultimately working towards is creating, what you're ultimately working towards is creating a set of allies and someone who is in the leadership space who can be your champion, whatever that looks like for you. If it is kickstarting those personal journeys, if it is having small conversations, using recent events within the organization as sort of conversation starters that help you start to align those are ways that you can help. What would you add to that, Phyllis?
I would agree. If there's someone, a champion in your organization, maybe it's someone that is in a more leadership position, and talking with them, again, those brown bags, getting to know other people. A lot of times in organizations, you're thinking one way and you don't know that other people are thinking the same way. You just don't know until you start to have these conversations with people like, oh, okay, there's a few people. And that's how that start out. There's a few people saying, hey, we really want to do something, or we're really interested in it, but you never know because we're all so busy. We're all focused on the work, and we don't always have time for those conversations or to develop those things. And the brown bag approach really seems to be really helpful, that it allows other people who may be on the fence, to come in and just be able to listen. Especially like in Zoom, to lurk behind, just listen, and see what's going on and check out the conversation. We live in such a polarized world right now that people are even afraid to have those conversations. So to let people know that, we want to meet people where they are, and here's a kind of helpful, easy way to get started. Margaret had a question. What are some techniques to build inclusiveness among co-op members that don't see each other regularly? Caregivers interact with the clients, but they have limited contact with fellow caregivers. Wonderful question, Margaret.
Yeah.
One of the things that I suggest is it may be being a little bit more intentional about having those, not necessarily brown bag, but just to get together. This whole Zoom thing and virtual thing is really kind of throwing everybody off. So being able to make an intentional space to get as employees, just to get together, and then allowing people to contribute how they want to get together, how they want to be able to interact. Start at the beginning just with those kind of things. We have in our organization, it's not a co-op, but we have an employee engagement group, and they plan activities for us to get involved, and we get to meet people because we're all virtual. And so how do we to keep that momentum going? That can be the start of then having those inclusive lens and that kind of meeting, and that can blossom out. Other ideas, Jerica?
I just want to say that, so often this question is about, we already have a really heavy workload, just getting through my day is a lot. So some of this answer for me has to involve decision-making throughout the organization. We have to be serious about valuing this kind of engagement, because it doesn't happen without support and structure when folks are really, really busy. So what can you do? Is there a space? Can you get, time within your regular workday that is not just an add-on? Like, you get time within your workday, but then you still have to do all of that other work. And so it's really as if your workday was just extended. So thinking about how does that look? How do we actually shift our responsibilities to be able to create time for this, even if it's only once a month?
It's a great question. It's very challenging, isn't it? To some people think of this as an add-on, and really, for it to work, an organization that we've seen that really have this inclusive culture and an embedded equity and diversity inclusion, they really have made it a way of the way the organization runs. It's just the way they do things, and it's not an add-on or a separate thing. It's really what they do.
So for anybody who's looking or challenged about how do we have to sell this to somebody, how do we convince somebody that this is worthwhile? Our recommendation is always to connect it back to the mission. What are you about? And how is equity required to make that happen? Because I'm going to assume everyone in this room, equity is required to really achieve what you are after, the purpose of your organization with intentionality. So thinking about that and using that in your conversations can be helpful. We are almost at time. Are there any other questions? Any other reflections from folks?
Just want to share our contact information. Any other questions? Okay.
Well, we appreciate the time. We've enjoyed the conversation.